Yeah, as Michael just said, I'm Katie Terazakis. I'm from the Department of Philosophy, and thank you very much for being here in the middle of the busy day, and especially thanks to the people at Teaching Learning Services for the invitation, Michael Starenko and Rebecca Johnson and Neil Hare for the opportunity. Before, I hope you like the first slide, because I'm going to just leave it there for a little while. It's Gerhard Richter, still from an installation at the Dia Art Foundation. So before I even launch into the PowerPoint, I just wanted to share with you, or to confess some of my background convictions about reflection, so that you see where I'm coming from. And I know that I probably owe you a definition of reflection, and you maybe took a chance without even knowing what that was to come and hear about it. And I think I probably need the whole time to define it as much as I'm going to be able to define it, but I will. So I'll tell you the background convictions first, and then feed in more of a definition. So that is just that I think that reflection is good, that I think it's so very good that we can't have too much of it. You can't do too much reflecting. And the reason that I think reflection is so very good that you can't do too much reflecting is because reflection is the way that we cultivate and build strong, resilient identities and personalities. I think that reflection is so very good that you can't have too much of it, because reflection is the way that we come to act in ways that are well-reasoned and responsible. People sometimes joke about a dilemma, or talk about a dilemma between just being able to act and reflecting about it. And I want to offer that any dilemma between reflection and good, responsible action is a false dilemma. Good, responsible action is reflective action. I also think sometimes when we hear the word reflection, we think of something that's very inward, introspective, silent. But I want to suggest that reflection is just as much something social, something interpersonal, even psychodynamic, which means that we can observe it in practices that affect and are affected by others. So I'm going to show something like 18 slides. I think, I didn't really get a chance to time it yet, but I hope that I'm going to talk for something like 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation at the end. And the examples that I'm going to give throughout the presentation, I was making last minute. I couldn't send you my PowerPoint till 1 a.m. or something, because I was making last minute decisions about which examples I wanted to give. And I picked a couple so I could explain them better, I hope. But maybe I didn't, or maybe they're not the best examples. So what I did was I created a couple of appendices. And just for anyone who's interested, Michael agreed to post the PowerPoint. If you want to check it out and go to the appendices, hopefully in some kind of comprehensible way, there are more examples for each of the different approaches that I'm going to be talking about. Also, I should say what I'm trying to do here is just really generalize and crunch together in my own words what I think really works and really makes sense to me, but that's culled from or taken from a few millennia of canonical philosophical texts and some more recent texts on metacognition. So I am going to just be speaking for myself, but for those of you who would like the much richer, more substantiated route of discovery that I'm not really so much confessing here, at the bottom of most slides there's just a little parenthetical with the researchers or philosophers' names who I think I'm stealing from. And again, if you're interested, there's a really informal bibliography at the end. You're welcome to ignore it. You're welcome to check it out online so that you can retrace that route of explanation if you want to do that. So what I want to do, and what's coming up, so you're prepared, is I want to mention what I think is a dilemma that most of us face regarding reflection and metacognition. I want to suggest a couple of questions that this dilemma approaches, actually 3 questions. I want to spend a little bit of time fleshing out why I think they're important questions that are good to ask. And then I want to offer, by way of a kind of answer, 3 basic categories, or 3 really interlocking, very much mutually implicating, mutually overlapping modes of the kinds of things we can be thinking about, the kinds of practices we can be thinking about applying that help address these questions. Okay, so here we are. A little more with Richter before we go on. I mentioned the dilemma. I'll just try to put it in my own words quickly first, so hopefully we begin on the same page. I think that most of us have found, and even if you don't think about it in these terms, I think you'll realize that you have probably found this in different terms, that formative assessment is one of the best ways that we know how to foster metacognition, or student success. That is, metacognition, students thinking about their own thinking, students' ability to self-evaluate in process because they're responding to regular evaluations and exchanges with the professor. So these are things like low-stake quizzes and assignments that then repeat on higher stakes things later. And there's all kinds of things that people do that count as formative assessment. But just for the time being, what matters is formative assessment does seem to be one of the best ways that we know how to foster metacognition and student success. And probably the reason that it does that so well is because it encourages students to think for themselves about how much do I really need to drill, to repeat, to present this kind of thing, in order to feel like I possess this knowledge enough for a payoff. And the payoff is the grade, success in the class, this kind of thing. Formative assessment, in other words, is focused by design on outcomes. And it turns out that this is part of the problem with it, and this is a problem that you see a lot of researchers discussing now. That is, students who are focused on drilling for outcomes tend to be really good at pattern following. They also tend to get really good at reading the professor, at deciding which rhetorical forms we like a lot. In other words, jumping through hoops. One of the researchers I like a lot, named Erwin Weitzer, calls this schmutz, or I should say schmutz. I guess it's not dirt. Schmutz. Well, you know, I think anytime you can say Yiddish on almost the first slide, it has to be a good presentation, but I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. So schmutz. But schmutz, in other words, a word maybe closer even to my heart, reification or thingification, making the class into something and the learning into something operationalized. So I'm really just getting good at that kind of pattern following, and that's for the good students. The problem with that is students don't learn how then to transfer the knowledge. They don't learn as well, the research is showing, they don't learn as well how to transfer the knowledge they're taking from one learning activity into another. And it doesn't result in mental agency or reflection. Students are just thinking about how to kind of quickly and painlessly get through the process, and they do get really good about that, really good with that. And another issue with it that maybe some of us have seen in practice is it also tends to encourage something more authoritarian, which I'm really interested in, and I think is one of the more unspoken and implicit things that goes on in what we're doing, which is this projective identification with the instructor. Because students have to, in a way, satisfy the instructor, the ones who aren't really thinking about it end up mimicking or aping the language of the instructor, even the styles of the instructor, and not necessarily translating those, or not in fact translating those into their own ways of understanding their own languages. And again, those are the good students. So to sum it up, to state the dilemma more clearly, we still know formative assessment works. We still know it encourages metacognition. It's a good, but how can we utilize the obvious strengths of formative assessment toward metacognition without undermining discovery, creativity, critique, in other words, self-awareness and reflective thinking? So that's that's really my guiding dilemma. So what's characteristic of reflective thinking? Now I want to paraphrase the philosopher John Dewey. First of all, reflective thinking arises from a felt demand, a real perplexity. It gives rise to experiential learning, the best kind of learning, learning through experience, to the degree that we experience ourselves first as piqued, as really confused or disturbed, perplexed by a question, and feeling a real desire for its solution. If you ask me how I know something that at one point I was really quite confused about or annoyed with, I'm not just going to be giving you an account of some independent fact in the world. I'm giving an account of myself. I'm invested now in the knowledge that I've made. So the first question that I want to draw out is, what's the best way to frame the dilemmas that motivate our given disciplines or methodologies, with an eye towards supporting the agency of those who will work through those dilemmas for themselves? And to back up a little bit, that term or concept of agency or identity, maybe some of you are already saying, isn't that just a little bit vague? I mean, what are we really trying to put our finger on here? Isn't the whole notion of something like agency or selfhood or subjectivity even a little bit discredited in later modern forms of thinking? And I guess what I really want to say here is, together with Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, so what? So what if we, if we're not talking here about an essence or a fixed definition when we're talking about the self? The fact is, I relate. Anytime I check in with myself, I find that I am underway in a whole host of relationships, and I find myself in those relationships. I relate to myself, especially when I have some kind of conflict or dilemma that I become aware of through my felt need to sort it out. Those conflicts are, again, where I experience myself as willing, desiring, needing some solution, and then where I can potentially notice that I do have some kind of efficacy, some kind of ability to work something out. So the second question that I want to draw out as a guiding question is, if the self, whatever we want to say it is, identity, agency, is forged in relationships, including or foremost to itself, that is reflection, how can we support such relating in our classes? And I want to pause even yet again here to talk a little bit more about identity, or maybe just to say not that much more about it, but to implore you to consider that that this is something you might consider further later. You might take under consideration later this question of how our identity relates to all of our commitments, our motivations, our allegiances. I think there's a lot more that we could say about this, and there's probably examples that we could kind of give. But I think if I was going to say, in case of mental flood or fire, or you're just teaching a busy day so you don't remember now what you're not going to remember at 6 p.m. what we were talking about at 12 p.m. If you could only grab one thing and right now you're just going to do it, I would say go ahead and forget everything from here. If you really need to, you can watch it or something. But just consider for yourself later how much the matter of building really resilient, strong identities, or at least identities we can recognize for ourselves, is behind all sorts of allegiances and commitments that we see people involved in all of the time. So I would say we're really not done with this question of identity, and it can be, I think, helpful in figuring out how to approach all sorts of things when we're speaking with others, including our students. And at the same time, I want to suggest that a resilient identity is a multidimensional identity, an identity that is drawn from so many different pursuits, or enough invested different kinds of practices that I can afford to take a hit. that if I figure out that something I've previously identified with, some political party, some philosopher, whatever it is, if I realize that that's become from my current perspective immature or toxic, I can afford to let it go without splitting or losing myself, because I'm drawing my identity in some patterned way I can recognize from a host of other sources. So I'm sure we could say more about that, but I just hopefully wanted to mark it for some kind of return. Okay, so I think that identity is at the heart of reflective thinking. There's no reflective thinking without it, and there's no reflective thinking that isn't about our identities. So how is reflective thinking different from just having a belief? I believe we're sitting here, but I'm probably not reflecting on the fact that we're sitting here. Here again, I'm drawing from John Dewey, as well as Aristotle, but so what? Dewey tells us that we know that beliefs arise from sense perception and induction from sense perception, but reflective thinking is much more about types of beliefs, the kinds of categories into which we place our beliefs, or looking at the kinds of beliefs that we have, deciding into which kinds of types or categories they fit, thinking about the conditions of belief. In other words, thinking about what counts as evidence. So here's a silly example. I was preparing this PowerPoint yesterday, and I received an email from Michael saying, here are the details for your talk. And around the same time, I received an email, same inbox, same language, saying, if you send this to 20 more people, you are going to have great good fortune. So again, you know, really a lot of similarities between those emails, and yet I've placed them into entirely different categories of belief. There are entirely different possibilities or conditions under which they could even possibly count as evidence. And this kind of questioning or thinking about categories, even when we do it in a way, most of the time very quickly, without thinking more about it, we can return to think about those kinds of categories that count or don't count as evidential. This, I want to say with Dewey, is characteristic of reflective thinking. This is what Socrates called the second sailing. This is what Kant associates with critique. I think there's one philosopher in the room who's saying, well, like, you know, kind of, sort of, but I'm allowed to say it because it's not a philosophy talk. So it's the second sailing, and it's critique. That is to say, just insofar as this is a pivoting back to think about conditions that were really there all along, but that were implicit, that we might not have thought that much about, but they're affecting our judgments. They're affecting how we think. And in our later modern paradigms, especially in our teaching classrooms, we can think a lot about those conditions because they've shifted a lot and they're continuing to shift. So just things like a certain amount of civility in the classroom, or having access to a shared language that we each have a relatively good mastery of. These are conditions for even having a class work. And we could go on. So the final question, or the third and final question I want to draw out to orient the rest of what comes is, how can we encourage the study of conditions? Even though we're delivering content and we want to keep drilling and we want to keep delivering content, whatever it is that each of you work on, the study of conditions can always be brought up. And just turning to face those kinds of conditions is characteristic of a form of reflection that is identity building, and that I think really helps people to learn, helps the psychodynamics of a good classroom achieve lock-in. So this is just a repetition I'm doing for time. The guiding questions that I've now posed are, what are the best ways to frame the underlying dilemmas that motivate our disciplines and methodologies? How can we support the development of mental agency or identity or selfhood through staging opportunities to relate to and reflect upon our developing identity and agency? And how can we facilitate the study of the conditions of inquiry, its contexts, and its categories or best types? And now the rest of the presentation I'll devote to trying to account for these three very general and very much mutually overlapping kinds of modes. What I'm actually going to do, I'm really hoping now as I look at my watch that I can do any of it, but what I'm actually going to do is spend a lot of time on the first one, because it's a way of also explaining a lot about the second and the third. I'll still define and talk about the second and the third, but that's where I pulled a lot of the examples out and stuck them back in the appendix in the interest of having time for a conversation. So the three things that I put into my own words here, but that I want to try to develop so that the words make sense to all of us, are narrative, signification, and disappointment. Or if you like to speak less cynically than I like to speak, you can call it surprise. So what about narrative? This might be a little bit of a spoiler. I should say spoiler alert, but philosophers have been at this for almost 3 millennia, and we've had some help from psychologists and cognitive scientists more recently, but it is still the case that the origin of consciousness and very much about its functioning remains a mystery. Sorry. But it is the case, and I think that any of us can test that for ourselves, that my consciousness responds to narration. Each of our individual consciousnesses responds to narration. There is a really great teeming debate right now in philosophy and related disciplines about whether consciousness is essentially narrative, whether it is storified in its essence. I'm just sidestepping that whole thing. I just want to make the much more testable, I think observable claim that our consciousness will respond to narration. And why? Because narration provides points of reference, often sequential, often a through line that allows us to pause, to notice, to mark something and remark on it for further contemplation. This is something that one of the metacognitive researchers, who I think is really great, Pianco, calls rescannings, the rescannings that are so important to really developing mental agency. It's what one of my favorite philosophers, Herder, calls Besinnung, taking awareness. Narrative allows us to stop, pause, and notice because we're in the midst of some kind of continuum. Now, I'm really lucky because I get to teach Plato in many of my classes, and I think that Plato provides probably the most narratively rich body of works yet in the Western canon. So I've got tons of things to pull from, but it doesn't even matter, I think, or it enormously matters, but it's up to you to decide, based on what you teach, where the stories are. I mean, maybe you're teaching a class on viscosity, and there's a wonderful set of stories to be told about the transformations some important set of substances have gone through, or the history of discovering that. This is what great popular science writers really excel at, right? They're really great at figuring out who are their heroes, or their substances, or their debates, or their rituals, or some funky thing, like I saw a new book on like heirloom tomatoes, the whole history of everything but through heirloom tomatoes. And this gives us a kind of pegboard that we can then hang ideas on or open up problems in a kind of context that people can relate to. Narrative allows people to do imagining and visualizing. It allows us to do with students directed memory retrieval, and it's much easier to remember a story or a metaphor than it is to remember a formula, at least for most of us. It allows us sometimes to do empathizing or sympathizing, or at least relating, so thinking about my relationship to that, whatever it is, and to move between the particular and the general and back again. And all of those things I just named are crucial movements for reflective thinking. Those are the things you're able to do if you're good at reflective thinking. The story or narrative that when you think about which ones might I like to tell, it needn't have some obvious and direct moral. I usually don't like them when they do. If you consider, I mean, even if you didn't come to this talk with the Platonic dialogues freshly in mind, most of us have at least enough a sense of who Socrates was to remember. I guess too bad. He doesn't tell you anything. He knows he doesn't know. His knowledge is as worthless as a dream. You're not going to get the lesson or the content from what justice really is, and so on and so forth, from reading a Platonic dialogue. But you are going to relate to a host of characters who remind you of all sorts of things, and you are going to have an occasion to ask yourself how you relate to all kinds of things about the narrated scene. I want to suggest, too, that narrative is not just about stories. it's how we make sense of any idea when we think about how to get that idea into a communicative vehicle. In fact, I have a theory of my own. I'm stealing from other people to do it, but it's sort of kind of this version of it of my own. The strong of a claim is my own. I think narrative is actually at its most reflective when it is translational. That is when we're taking an insight from one realm and trying to figure out how to get it to make sense in another realm. Something that makes sense visually and describing it to a person who's not seeing it, or vice versa. Translating between senses and even between media, between the different ways we present information. I think that translational kind of narrativity is probably the most reflective form of narrativity. Of whatever I said. I can't even retrace it now, so I wasn't being reflective. I think that translational narrativity is probably the most reflective form. I mentioned before at the beginning that I think a resilient identity is a loci, a matrix of different commitments and different practices. And that's exactly what we're using and what we're building, like a muscle, when we do the work of translating ideas from one realm to another. We're building that kind of multidimensional identity. Imagine, I mean, we all look at social media sometimes, right? Facebook. Imagine just some hilariously apt visual meme that you saw sometime that was so funny. But it was just one page, one quick shot, and it summed up some whole big funny experience we all share. The person who was able to do that was no dummy. They got the whole experience. They just decided to be flippant about it. Or imagine some great piece of instrumental music, which you have to hear sometimes because it is so great, because it captures perfectly some mood, some sense of the world or some season, and you want to go back to that mood or you want to dwell on that mood, but the instrumental music manages to do it even without other forms of reminder. Imagine or consider what has to be in place to do successfully that kind of translation. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. And I think we can use these translational activities in a whole host of ways in our classes. You might consider, for example, getting people to identify some implicit assumption or bias, and then working out an argument that would defend it or would debunk it in some way. And then looking at that argument and reflecting on what they had to do, the mental map they had to make, but just reflecting on what it took in a journal assignment. Or you might talk about, or get some students, they're better at it than me, to make some of those visual puns. Or to do animated videos. I know that people in teaching learning services, I haven't taken advantage of you yet, but I mean, I know they're great at helping people devise how best to make videos for their classes. The work there, the reflective work, is figuring out what kind of video you really want to make that isn't just, after all, a lecture someone can come and see. Maybe you're talking about translating ideas through different software or different modeling possibilities. And you can tell, we all know when these kinds of things work, precisely because they affect us. If you go, wow, or you laugh because you think something's funny, if you're laughing, it's because you get it. You get it enough to laugh, and if you get it enough to laugh, you can start saying why. And you even desire to say why, which means you can identify not just a pattern, but the meaning of a pattern across modes. This is cross-validation. This is the stuff that that traditional models of teaching metacognition aren't so good at helping us develop, that cross-validation where we have not just the pattern, but the account of why it is a pattern, and the desire to talk about it because it's funny or it's affecting in some other way. So I want to give a couple of examples. I don't really know how I'm doing for time. I'm just going to carry on. I have to escape from this. These just fell in my lap this week, and I'm so lucky that I get to be able to share them. I'll try not to take too much time with an explanation, but we have some amazing, fantastic ASL interpreters devoted to the College of Liberal Arts who have an interest in philosophy, and I think foremost an interest in somehow translating our philosophy classes, where there are so many terms that they end up having to spell out, and we've just flown on to the next paragraph because they don't exist yet in ASL, those terms, and even if they did have those terms, the students haven't learned them yet, so the translator would still have to stop and dwell on the term. So they have created, or they're in the midst now of creating, a dictionary of terms, and we can maybe talk more about that, or I can tell you who to contact if that's something you're interested in. I only want to steal from them a couple examples because I think that they brilliantly, just very quickly do exactly what I'm talking about with this work of a kind of translation, you know, here from the concepts of philosophy to something totally visual. So this one is aesthetics. This is really fast and loose. Again, maybe the philosopher can plug her ears a little bit, but I would say roughly aesthetics is the study of sense-perceptual experience, especially as things appear to us. Oh, I just didn't point to this philosopher too. Sorry, Colin, didn't mean to misrecognize. The study of sense-perceptual experience, especially as things appear to be beautiful or ugly or sublime, and often as those experiences are staged in artworks. How the hell are you going to say that? You want to tell someone off the cuff what aesthetics is and why we think you're not educated unless you've got a class or two in it? Sum it up, one word, do it. Well, watch this. I can make it bigger if you want. It's amazing. The whole big, what the, and how does this affect me? Because, oh. I am going to make that sign every time I mention aesthetics in a philosophy class forever, ever since I've seen it. I saw it the first time a couple days ago because they just did this. Because I think it does the work. And even if there's more work to be done, someone stops and goes like this, and I'm going to make the students do it. I'm going to make them get up and do that. Because stopping and rescanning and pausing and doing that, even if you think there could be some better way, the fact that you're trying to tweak the term then means you're relating to it in a very reflective way because you know aesthetics is that plus a whole other thing. Or let's say you like your philosophy more logical. What about abduction? Abduction, inference to the best conclusion. How are you going to explain, boom, one quick visual on VisCom person, abduction, inference to the best conclusion? I don't know what this cost them, but look, inference to the best conclusion. It's amazing. Do it again. I'll do it again. I'll have him do it again. This, all of it, so probably that. And again here, if we decide it's not, if there's more to abduction than that, I don't think so. I think it's perfect. But if I'm wrong, if you decide I'm wrong, that is doing something in a different language that then we can rescan on and be translating back and forth with. And you know what I would even say if I was showing students this sign in class and talking about it, just to me, I don't want to waste your time, but I can't help but to notice this guy looks a little bit depressed about the whole affair, that there's not more to it. Not the sign, which is brilliant, but the loss of absolutes, the loss of certain big T truth. This is it, just, you know, the best we can do, so therefore. Okay, you could say I'm projecting, I'm reading into it. He doesn't look depressed at all. But the fact that he gives me the opportunity to confess why I think philosophers can do all kinds of things with abduction and not teach us all kinds of things anymore about metaphysical truths, he just gave me the opening. So sorry. You know, I know a great philosopher who used to call a certain form of speaking the Yiddish modus tollens. Modus tollens is a logical form, but the Yiddish modus tollens is, if not this, what else? So it's that, like, it's all you have. So make work, you know, make the best use of it that you can. But again, maybe I'm just hanging my hat on that pegboard. At least it gives us something to work with. Or let's say my PowerPoint and my big PowerPoint. Let's say you want to just give your students a playful reminder that the class they're in has been structured by you in advance in the best way you know how to help them learn progressively over time, building on the skills that you've learned, that you've taught them, or that they've learned together with you. And let's say that what you mean by planning that in advance is you've given them a constitution, a framework for the class. It's called the syllabus, and they should read it. Well, it's your job to talk about why they should read it and give them all kinds of opportunities to read it and to create a syllabus that's relevant. But let's say just once at the beginning of class, or just somehow in a way that looks like an accident, this comes up on your screen. This is one of those memes that was making its way around Facebook that first week of classes that we all liked. Now, is it silly? Of course. You're not going to spend 20 minutes on this in class. But if it's paired with other things you're doing to draw students' attention to the framework of the class, what it's doing is creating a context. It's shoring up a culture. It's a shared cultural reference that asks us to extend our culture. It asks students to imagine a culture in which the most interesting people in the world think that you're very silly if you're not closely familiar with the constitution for the class that you're in. So again, it gives that kind of cross-validation and also multiple points of diffused authority. Your authority in the classroom is going to work best where it looks least like it's coming from you. So give it to the most interesting guy in the world and a host of other characters that you're bringing up narratively. Let's go to the more serious and somewhat less flippant stuff. I want to, this is probably the place I'll dwell the longest. I want to talk more about the ways we might utilize narrative in class, since I have kind of defined narrative as widely as possible, and just give a couple of examples that hopefully people can think about the ways that you would make use of similar things or in your own classes. But class dialogue of all types, that is class dialogue with the professor, I want to engage my students in a range of dialogues right from the very first day, right from the first 10 minutes when they sit down, when I ask each of them for an account of what they're bringing to the class and what they expect to get out of it. And I hope to do various things that will encourage them to be honest, like to be extremely pleased when the first very negative answer comes through. They don't expect much from the class at all, they were put into it by their advisor, etc. But this is my first opening for a storified response. It's my first opening to get a sense of what people are actually invested in so that I can show where there's some overlap between us. And to get students as much as possible dialoguing with their peers. One example that's come up in my class that's probably specific to a philosophy class is a debate about the existence of God. I want to confess to you that the most boring question in the history of ideas to me is, does God exist? This is to me not a question that I am especially piqued by, just me personally. But what I learned is my students are transfixed by this question. They could talk about it all day long, but not necessarily about the philosophers who have really good arguments, pro or con, in the history of philosophy. So I learned from students that it's a really worthwhile thing for me to stage the occasion for them to kind of realize they want to have a class debate, and they want to debate the existence of God because they think they have some really good reasons, pro or con. So they have that debate, they split themselves up as they like to. It continues in an online forum and it's an in-class forum. They split themselves up if they want to try out different things, but mostly according to whether they're really believers or atheists or agnostics, and they have it out. What's interesting to me, and the reason I can really use that in class, is it's my chance to teach the fundamentals of argumentation, like weighing evidence, considering objections, interpretive generosity, and even better, it's how I can watch them come to the dilemmas that are going to make different philosophers relevant to them. It turns out that philosophers have some really great answers to this question that become great answers also for science and logic and figuring out the kinds of things we can know. So that's a kind of story that I can then grab onto, even if the debate wouldn't have been otherwise my first choice. As I said, I know that maybe doesn't fit to anybody who's not teaching philosophy, but something that is possibly more generally applicable is this question of whether we allow personal electronic devices in class, things like cell phones and laptops. I've tried everything, total prohibition, total permissiveness. It's now for the last couple of years become the subject of my first class assignment. So students research what is now being found out about the use of personal electronic devices by students in class. They have to weigh in on the research, they have to talk about it, they have to argue about it. There are several stages built in, but they end up writing the policy, including which devices are included, how to deal with people who abuse the policy in a way that is undermining for others. And then they vote on what the policy is actually going to be after they've looked at whatever their possibilities they come up with are. Now, do I know in advance with relative certainty how that vote is going to go? Of course. I know that they will allow the use of personal electronic devices in class. It's always interesting to me how many actually say that they don't want to do that. But even those who don't want to do it are never anywhere near the majority. And even those who don't want to do it are never willing to make their personal preference not to have them into a rule on others. And that's something very interesting that I can then use, because through the assignment we are learning about ways that citations and weighing evidence are important. We're learning about different ways that students argue with and have to respond to one another's argue with one another and have to respond to one another's positions, because part of the assignment involves revising the policy based on things others have said. Some of them get to know each other, sometimes on the online forum, sometimes in class. So again, it creates a context for other forms of narration and dialogue later, and it opens up a dilemma. Guess what? Sorry guys, science, if you have any interest in that kind of thing, and at least at its current state in studying this kind of thing, says you people are too immature to handle these things. And yet you've just decided to use them anyway. So what gives? What's the dilemma? What are you challenged to figure out, either about how these studies worked or about you having access to some insight about how you learn that they didn't know? And the dilemma then gives me something that I can work with, and it makes it much easier to deal with what happens then when the use of them don't work out. The use of the personal electronic devices doesn't work out so well. I want to mention one more. I can't help it. I'm going to bracket, I did bracket there, I knew this would happen. I'm going to bracket more of these examples and assignments that will come up possibly in later slides, or possibly just in the appendix if you look at it. But I did want to mention 2 thought experiments. Because even though thought experiments are the specialty of philosophers, they're a really great low-tech way that you can think about what lesson you're trying to learn, or what things your methodology is or discipline are presenting, and construct some fun ways for students to dig into them. There's a famous thought experiment some of you may already know about, involving a drowning child. Peter Singer poses this thought experiment. The horrible thing about this thought experiment, many horrible things about this thought experiment, but he came up with this a long time ago, and every time I mention it or teach it, it's even more relevant than the last time. So that's horrific and about the world, but that's why it's important to have this thought experiment. So imagine that on the way here you pass a shallow pond, and there's a small child drowning in that pond. You're almost late, so if you take a minute, you will be late, you'll save a life. But you're also wearing an amazing pair of shoes, and something about this amazing, expensive designer pair of shoes, I don't know, you need a shoehorn to get it off. Like you don't have time to take off the shoes and save the kid. You're gonna wade into the pond and ruin your shoes if you decide to save the kid. So what do? Let's imagine you come here, there's a few minutes before we start, and you say, "Why, this kid just died in front of me?" And we ask you, and we try to figure out why you decided not to save the kid. And let's say that you say, "Well, I mean, check out my shoes, they're amazing." Then we would say that you're an immoral person. You let a trivial interest trump the most important interest of all, someone's interest to staying alive. Or maybe, getting here on time was important. I thought it might be a good talk. Well, sorry, that's trivial too, compared to the life of a child. Or maybe you would say, well, yeah, I mean, that sucks, but no one else was helping. There were a lot of other people on campus, and I'm sure they could hear him, and they didn't help. Well, there again, the fact that other people are indifferent or incompetent only makes your moral responsibility greater. You had better act, because who else is going to act? And look around. Or maybe you would say, I'm not responsible, I'm not his parent. I didn't put him in the pond, the dummy slipped on some mud. No, I laugh. But then we would say, there's some things that's still really wrong with you, because we have the intuition that you can be responsible for situations you didn't create. You didn't put him in the pond, but if you can help with relatively little harm to yourself and you choose not to help, then you're responsible for helping. And what we realize as we work through this, that actually, the laughter hopefully confirms it, we all agree. We think you should help the drowning kid. But the brilliance of the thought experiment is this. Singer says, well, guess what? There are children dying half a world away. You happen not to pass them on the way here, but they're really dying. We can prove it. And there are really organizations that are very well run, that know how to use their dollars effectively, that really can keep them from dying. So why aren't you doing everything you can to help those agencies do their work? Why aren't you responding to the child you didn't happen to see? And then people inevitably come up, my students sure do, with a host of reasons. Well, it's my hard-earned dollar and I like to use it how I like to use it. Or, their countries are really badly run. We should thin the herd anyway, some social Darwinism, or whatever it is that I torture myself by listening to students say. The brilliant thing is Singer's already talked about the types, the categories of belief, and not he's debunked them, you've debunked them. You've already realized that by your own standards, what you're not doing means you're immoral. By your own standards, you hold assumptions, you hold convictions that you don't have the courage to act on. And this is your chance to notice what you really think and to decide to act on what you really think, to transform yourself or to give a more thorough account in which you could recognize yourself in the non-action. That was probably way too much. You see why I decided to downsize my examples. I like to talk about them too much, I think. Do you think we can go for 10 more minutes before? So so you can see the structure of the whole, and I'll stop giving examples. Is everyone up for that? Is everyone able to do that? Okay, so just in sum, I think utilizing narrative is something, that's viable for all of us. It allows us to pose regulative ideals, positive ones and negative ones, how a really great reflective thinker deals with disappointment, how a recalcitrant, bullying non-thinker deals with that kind of thing. It allows us to teach the ethos of charitable interpretation. It allows us to get students moving from the particular to the general and back again, to move from the micro to the macro, to think about what counts as evidence, to think about the conditions for their own learning, to interpret their own earlier positions and the positions of others. In other words, to assume the standpoint of reflective distance. And then to know that there always is the standpoint of reflective distance. What they're getting out of the class isn't just the immediate payoff. There's something more going on here, and they're already attuned to thinking about what it is. So I promise to move much more quickly now. I'm going to name the other two without examples, and these are two again that I'm drawing from the history of ideas that are fleshed out in more thorough ways in some of the philosophers that you can look up if you choose to do that. But signification and reflection is one I at least still want to mention. We're doing the work of signifying all the time. Signifying is just when we take one thing to mean something else. So I take dark clouds to mean there's going to be a rainstorm coming. Signifying itself is not reflective, but thinking about the conditions for signification is a way of thinking about what counts as evidence. And this is one of the great ways that we can get students considering how to be more reflective. So if you need to do, and we all, I think, need to do in-class signifying assignments, like formative assessment assignments, you can feed into formative assessment and other straight signifying kind of assignments all kinds of questions and modeling exercises that ask us to consider why those work. So just what I mean is, if you have a low-stakes quiz that has smaller versions of the questions that you're going to end up giving on a high-stakes exam, it's crucial that you're trustworthy in your signification. Those questions better show up on the exam, and they better show up in a way that students have been trained to recognize. That has to hold. But what about then having a conversation about the drilling in which you ask students, what kind of theory of education are we modeling this on? and what would need to go into, just maybe bullet points, what would need to go into a theory of education in which we did more than this kind of drilling? What would you want to see done? So already you're transforming the exercise that you want to be doing anyway. Or, you know, maybe you have students read some of the literature and research on student evaluations. Invariably, it shows that students are the worst people to evaluate at the end of a class what they actually learned from a class. But we're still giving them. So we can have a really neat conversation and a theory of education, or, I don't know, something else, about why we still keep giving those evaluations. So just consider, I stop the examples, how certain technologies, languages, behaviors, etc., condition the signifying activities we're relying on in class, and think about ways we can mark those signifying activities for reflection. I realize I'm probably not giving you enough time to look at or dwell on this slide. They're just going to bang on to the other because it's all disappointing anyway, right? Wasn't planning that. So, again, a background dilemma motivates this slide, or this idea that I want to present. Reflective thinking is really optimistic and really confident. We're able to suspend the conclusion and to inquire really actively before we know what the conclusion is, because we feel pretty confident and optimistic that we'll have a better conclusion, better results in the end. So it's optimistic and confident. But the worst metacognizers, as you know, the students who are worst at everyone always talks about this, worst at knowing what the difference between what they think they know and what they can actually account for, they're really optimistic too. They're overconfident. They're characterized by that. That's the whole secret there, is they decide not to study and not to ask for help because they think they already know, or they think it's so easy that they can figure it out a few hours before the exam. So what's the difference between these two kinds of confidence? If I had managed to finish in 40 minutes, I would now make a long, awkward silence that forced one of you to answer. But is one of you willing to answer in 1 second so we can go quick instead? What's the difference between these two forms? There's no right answer. I just want to know, once and for all. Why is everyone so confident? Just joking. I think there's an answer. What's the difference between the confidence of a good reflective thinker who's willing to suspend conclusions, maybe even indefinitely, but keep inquiring, and just the dude who thinks he can phone it in, maybe look at your PowerPoints a couple hours before the exam? Please.
One is about risk-taking, right? Like being okay with discomfort and that sort of sense of, that you talked about in the beginning, that sense of desire, like being comfortable with that to a certain extent. And the other is, it rests on comfort. It rests on assuredness. Yeah.
I think that's great. That's better than I was going to say it, so thank you very much. I think that's exactly right. And I think we get used to ourselves as having that kind of ability the more we've done it, which is to say the more that we've built up an identity, the more that we've noticed ourselves doing it, which is the reflective element. So that's what we want. We want to give students pause. We want to surprise them, sometimes even shock them with the difference between what they thought they knew and what they can actually defend. This is, of course, a Socratic model, and we know it didn't go so well for Socrates, of course. I don't know how many spoilers are packed into that. But we want to upset people. We want to upset people in the right measure, which means in a way that they can learn from. We want to support a scene in which students can question the reasons for their beliefs, the types of beliefs they have, which categories into which their beliefs really fit. We want to create a scene in which students can live through that uncertainty and try to do an inference, a set of inferences, and maybe get it wrong, or maybe self-correct together, or maybe just dwell together in the uncertainty and realize what's coming together while they remain uncertain about certain things. That wasn't planned. So I would say, in fact, disappointing or unentitling is part of every great narrative about learning. And it can be built into any class content and form. Now, let's see. Oh, I failed to show you that one. Sorry. That's what I just said. So in the narrative sense, thank you, you know, we can view disappointed characters and how they cope or fail to cope. I gave some of my examples. We can thematize intellectual conflict, which is what I love to do, especially with students who love conflict, and there are usually a few. I need that energy because I want to emphasize conflict as the scene of development once I see what they actually care about. And this is something to the form of the class as well as the content. It's really helpful for me, at least, to build the class around a set of explicit key issues that you see different thinkers working through. Maybe you do that chronologically and historically, maybe according to the types of answers or the types of themes, but either way, you see the disappointment of different bodies of knowledge as they're progressively corrected or debunked over time, and you come to think of that as part of the culture of inquiry. I have a couple slides devoted to different disappointing class activities, and you can check them out if you want to be disappointed. I'm sure you will be. But the note that I want to close on, it's finally coming. My closing is finally here, but I'm going to say it. I want to return to the psychodynamics of reflective teaching. I feel like we could have done easily a whole presentation, a series of presentations that weren't about getting students to be reflective, but to thinking about our own reflections. And I want to offer the thought that either way, we're neglecting one side of the story or the other, but either way, when reflective thinking is happening, it is psychodynamic, it is interpersonal and social. And so as regards disappointment too, if you were to tell me that honestly you have never once had a disappointing teaching experience, a disappointing grading experience, I would say I'm pretty sure you haven't taught much at all yet.